2 children, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, and a motorbike. This is what Karachi is essentially becoming. I think this is one important thing that I wanted to mention. The second is something that I have mentioned many times before, but I will mention it again. The most important age group in a census is the age group between 15 and 24, because it is both the present and it is the future. In this age group, in 1981 census, the number of married women was 39%. The number of married men was 17 point some percent. Male literacy was 66%, female literacy was 63% in this city. And in this age group, today, the number of married women in this age group are less than 20%. The number of married men are less than 7%. And literacy for men and women is the same at 83%. So for the first time in the history of this city, you have an overwhelming majority of unmarried adolescents. And this is enough, as any sociologist will tell you, is enough to change gender relations and family structures. And family structures have changed dramatically. The Karachi Development Plan 2000, in that nuclear families are 54%. Under the same definition, nuclear families today are 89%. So you have this very major change. And it asserts itself in very many ways. Can't go into all of them. The other important factor is court marriages. We read in the newspapers that there were 800 applications for 800 court marriages per day. I couldn't believe it. So I asked my colleague Riaz Ahmad, I said, Riaz, zara pata to karo yaar, ye kaise ho sakta hai? This means about 1/3 marriages in Sindh are all court marriages. Can't be. So Riaz made a small study. In 1992, the number of court marriages registered, not applied for, we didn't know how many were applied for, in Karachi was 16 per day. In 2006, when Riaz looked at it, there were more than 200 applications per day for court marriages. Now you see, I won't go into details of how this is changing society, but these are indications of this very big change that is taking place. Let's move on to some other things which are related to infrastructure and which are related to inability to get a home. This is resulting in densification of settlements. In the old city today, you have areas which have densities of 4,000 plus per hectare. This again is a future. That is, even this we can tackle the housing problem. And these densities create terrible conditions, especially for use of toilets. इसी वास्ते HBFC का एक बहुत अच्छा ad है अब toilets के लिए. Anyway, you should listen to that ad. It sums up all the problems associated with toilets. The other problem with densities is 6 to 7 persons per room. With the result, the father doesn't come home. He has an excuse not to come home. The children stay away. This densification, according to our research, has promoted new freedoms, if you can call them freedoms, new freedoms. People complain that this densification has promoted promiscuity. How they describe promiscuity is different from how you would describe it. But in any case, there are also these serious issues. There are lots of other issues that I could raise, but I will end with one. And that is globalization. The whole issue of this image of a world-class city that has created enormous problems for poor populations wherever this image has been pursued. And in Karachi, it has promoted a very strong anti-poor bias. But in addition to that, what I would like to say is that a big change is also taking place. The Dhan Mandi of today, we surveyed it in 2006, and the Dhan Mandi of 1992, which we surveyed then, are two different mandis. That was a mandi of semi-literate people who knew how to keep accounts. Today, it's young men, their children, sitting on computers, communicating with the whole world. The offices have changed, the dress has changed. And of course, it has been held by the rather strange slogan of the Export Promotion Bureau, which says, export all you can, which is also disastrous to the city in many ways. So this is the other change that is taking place, which has very long-term repercussions. And finally, is the problem of employment and the fact that for the new types of employment that are required, the city does not have the skills. And the city does not have the skills because the polytechnics that were set up in Ayub's time and the vocational schools that were set up in Bhutto's time no longer function. We have loads and loads of new universities, but this whole technical sector and its education has been completely wiped out. These universities are castles built on sand in the absence of this basic requirement that the city and academia needs. We can talk about many other things, but I'll finish here.
Thank you very much. We're going to open up the forum now for discussions, and I just want to add a little footnote that I would like for our audience to keep at the back of their minds. Being an academic, I have to have my say in all of this, and we can continue ad nauseum for several hours, with our speakers and with the rest of you. We have Charles Dickens' 200th anniversary, happening right now, and in a few rooms down, there is a celebration going on. And one of the things that we haven't kind of had on the horizon or within our gaze with this theme of the megacity is that it's a theme that's fairly timeless. It goes back well over 100 years, as Ronald highlighted, but a theme that is exploited beautifully in the novels and the writings of this great novelist, Charles Dickens. And in novels like Hard Times, for instance, which is one of my great favorites, he talks about the fictitious industrial town, which is Coketown. And he talks about the impending doom, which are the disconnections, the dislocations, the social, economic disjunctures that are happening as a result of urbanization, as a result of industrialization in the megacity of his time, which is London, the greatest megacity of our modern era, which is now called a global city, a world city. And those nomenclatures open up a whole other dialogue on what we mean by issues of globalization and urbanization today. Where is Karachi today in that sense, in that context of a megacity? Different from the late 1800s, we're the first quarter of the 21st century now, and as Arif Hassan Saab very, very potently has highlighted, issues of globalization mediate with cities, and cities like Karachi, and even secondary cities now, which we haven't touched upon, in myriad ways and very fascinating ways, and throw sort of into a state of chaos, how we should kind of pull apart all these issues, whether they be engaged by novelists or sociologists or economists and so forth. So I'd like to for you to keep that footnote in mind, that it's a theme that is, is very contemporary and yet has a very important historical context also. So let's begin with our first question. Yes, sir?
Yeah, my question is to Mr. Naqvi. As a fiction writer, you definitely are addressing the city. You're talking to it. It also talks back to you. Can you explain on two terms, architecture and voice, in this city?
Architecture and you said voice? Violence. Okay. All right.
Could you repeat the question?
Architecture and violence.
How does it talk back to you? How do you talk to it?
The short answer, sir, is that you'll find out in a year's time when my novel comes out.
Thank you.
You know, those are sort of two disparate issues that pertain to this city, that pertain to Mexico City, to Bombay. Architecture, the way, one tangible way of how architecture works on me as a novelist is that in a place like New York, one as an individual feels dwarfed.
Toni Morrison's jazz home at Metro. I remember. Yeah.
Whereas in a flatter city like Karachi, I don't feel dwarfed in the same way. So that's one very tangible way, and figuratively speaking, New York has been written about, sung about, has figured in film for the last 200 years. Karachi, on the other hand, is an open canvas. As a storyteller, I find it very exciting. As far as violence goes, you know, violence is cyclical in this city. I remember in recent memory in the early 90s when Karachi was horribly an anxious city. In the early 90s, Operation Cleanup of that the army conducted, one thought that Karachi was sort of would never recover, and yet in the last 10 years, in 2003, for instance, Karachi's homicide per capita ratio, the number of people who died in Karachi in comparison to the population, was lower than Boston and Seattle. 70 people died in a city of about 17, 18, 19 million. So, you know, we suffer violence, and there are periods of relative amity. As a novelist, some of this violence will seep through my novel. The topography of Karachi is very much present in my novel. And yet again, I'm not a historian and a sociologist. I'm a storyteller. And so what I am most concerned about is not the architecture or the violence, it's about how people, you and me and other people, interact with each other. I think human drama is independent of these two poles.
Yes, sir, back there. If you could just speak loudly, because we, yes, thank you.
I would like to, my question pertains to what Mr. D'Souza said right in the beginning. He talked about the urban decay and the green and environmental degradation, and he listed a number of factors. Well, there's no disagreeing there. But don't you think that a major factor for the urban decay is the onslaught of capitalism, whereby builders groups, whereby people who are seeking profits, they just make a scramble for going in for a building spree, and they get hold of all the playgrounds which are meant for children. They get hold of your amenity plots, and they start building start off with their construction activity, and they reap a mighty bonanza from that. This is what capitalism is all about. So don't you think a major reason for Karachi's urban decay is the onslaught of capitalism?
You were asking a very political question. I recently read a book called The Morality of Capitalism, and that described, it was interesting reading what the gentleman had to say. He says when we talk about capitalism, it isn't the kind of crony capitalism that we practice in Pakistan. It is a capitalism that involves the implementation of law, which unfortunately we don't have. But well, capitalism is a philosophy that has developed again probably over the last 200 or 250 years with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. But in terms of mankind and in terms of the development of megacities, it is basically business, whether it is industrial or whether it is people building buildings. Business and environment are diametrically opposed to one another. As you develop the concept of profit, as you develop the concept of getting better, consuming more, that's where you're going to have trouble with the environment. Just because this world has some sustainable limit to which it can be exploited, and we have probably gone past that. Generally in our cities, because that is where the major amount of exploitation takes place, the major amount of pollution that is developed.
Could I just add to Ronald's comment on capitalism? I think that rather than sort of looking at capitalism as some sort of an amorphous thing that has its effects on the urban landscape, and builders, etc., partake of that logic and use the force of creative destruction to change the landscape, I think what we must also keep in mind is a certain aesthetic sensibility that is appearing in cities like Karachi, all right? What does the elite want, right? So your average builder will say, yeah, fine, I'm making my profit, I am usurping this space, but the state itself, the modern state itself, its elite, the elite class of this country, also long for these spaces. Port Grand, spaces of consumption are desirable spaces. This is the new aesthetic sensibility of this particular quarter of this century. So rather than seeing the fault as that of this amorphous thing called capitalism, you know, it has a certain material sensibility and an aesthetic sensibility. And where does this aesthetic sensibility lie? Where does the demand come from? This is what people long for, right? It's what a particular